the Levites. So finally, the people understand what God wants them to understand. But now they're fearful to approach the tabernacle, which that was going to be necessary for them in bringing sacrifices and morning and evening offerings and prayers, and just the religious life of the people took place at the tabernacle. But now the people were terrified to approach. So in response to their fear, God's going to just set in order how the priesthoods operate in regard to their responsibility and the Levites and their service. And Joel wanted to actually open us up with a question tonight.
Yeah, as I was studying for this, verse 1 struck me as interesting, and I was kind of curious what others thought, where it says, the Lord said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear the iniquity related to the sanctuary. And you and your sons with you shall bear the iniquity associated with your priesthood. I don't know that I'd ever noticed that before. So I was curious what your thoughts were, what that bearing of that iniquity was. I think there's a number of things that it probably touches on.
I would think that as Christ being the ultimate sacrifice for the iniquities of us of the world, they were bearing the iniquities of the children of Israel as they offered up sacrifices on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously one of the ones is that they were charged with carrying out the sacrifices and performing the sacrifices and doing those things to atone for the people's sins, the high priest especially once a year. So I do think that is part of it. And you think about in the tabernacle before the altar, and we've talked about this before, but the graphic nature of their days, right? Their days were bloody days, and the smell of blood and those things would have been, I think, a constant reminder and a heavy reminder of the sins of the people and the sins of themselves too, right? Because priests had to first make atonement for themselves, and then they could make atonement for the people. So I do think that's a big part of it. Anything else?
Well, I'd mentioned to you before class, I think part of it's their responsibility to keep what happened last time, which was the rebellion of Korah, the challenging of the Levites to the priesthood. From that, they were to guard that, and any violation of that would be their responsibility. You mentioned to me that with responsibility comes accountability, and I think that's a big part of it. You look in verse 3, so the Levites are to help guard it as well, but the priests, they're able to have access to parts of it that the Levites don't, so they're the most responsible. They shall keep guard over you and over the whole tent, but shall not come near the vessels of the sanctuary, like the censers, or to the altar, lest they and you die. So it's not just the violator, the perpetrator, who goes to the place that they don't belong, but also the priests. And so I think that's part of the sense in which they bear the responsibility or bear the iniquity connected with the priesthood. If somebody gets in there that's not supposed to be, then the priests are responsible for safeguarding that position. And it will cost not only the one who enters in there or the perpetrator, but also the priests themselves who were entrusted with the care. And then in verse 5, you shall keep guard over the sanctuary, over the altar, that there may never again be wrath on the people of the children of Israel. So I think a big part of it was the responsibility to safeguard what had been entrusted to them and to ensure that no one else was able to come into close proximity of that.
Well, and that's the other thing that really stuck out to me is in the end of chapter 17, you have this recognition and maybe bestowing of honor in some sense on Aaron with the budding of his rod. His rod was chosen of the 12. So he gets the honor, but with the honor comes responsibility, right? And that made me start thinking about that parallel in our world, whether it be in James chapter 3, where there's the warning for teachers and preachers that you're going to be held to a stricter judgment. Hebrews 3, you think about the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20 and the warnings there to guard the flock. And so with that, with mothers, there's an honor and a blessing that comes with that, but there's a duty and a responsibility with fathers, with all of those different roles. And I think the truth is most of us, we like the prestige and we like the honor, but we don't always like the responsibility. And I think you'll even see that tonight. Luke and then May had something.
So just the point with the word bear in there, verse 1, the concept of bearing responsibility, or bearing the guilt. There's an endurance that has to be understood, that they are to be steadfast, continuing, trying to do what is right, and to the idea of bearing also removing that guilt, and to whatever issues that come from the people, that they have to bear and deal with those things.
Which echoes back to what Philip was saying about the echo of Jesus. May,
So the King Hezekiah that went into the temple and tried to, and the priest ran him out of there.
Oh, yeah, Uzziah, Amaziah, I think. Yeah, you're exactly right. He goes in there to burn incense, and they're the ones that bring him out. You're exactly right. So that's kind of where we see that in action with them bearing the responsibility for his transgression. They are the ones that have to.
And they had to go
To
up
eradicate
against the king back there.
Yeah.
that had
Good thoughts.
It established a precedent here where they did have some distinct authority in regards to the tabernacle and the worship. And so, I know we're not to the United Kingdom yet in the establishment of the king, but there's some things that are under their jurisdiction because of this. And I think that is a responsibility that is uniquely theirs.
I just thought it was an interesting opening
Phrase, yeah.
and something worth thinking about, because I do think there are applications to the fulfillment of Christ, but then I think there's applications to our walk too.
Yeah, verse 7, a phrase in verse 7 jumped out at me. The latter part of that verse, he says to the priest, I give your priesthood as a gift, and any outsider who comes near to it shall be put to death. And so, as has been mentioned, the priesthood was a desirable thing. That's why Korah wanted to have it. That's why later we're going to get to the divided kingdom. Jeroboam is going to make priests of all the tribes. Okay, it was a prestigious thing. It was a gift. It was a gift from the Lord. I mean, you think about, you're interceding between the people and God. Okay, and so there's a certain amount of prestige in that. You're leading in the worship of the Lord for the people. So it was a very coveted position, as we've seen. But thinking about this in the full story of Scripture, it gives us. People may look at the Old Testament and passages like this as, what's the purpose? How does it relate to us? This is how we're to understand it. It gives us a greater appreciation for who we are as Christians and for the blessings that we have in Christ. You go to 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, and without passages like this, and we can't really appreciate the full weight of what Peter's saying here as he's writing to Christians, all Christians, saying, as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, kind of like that priesthood. Priest was chosen by the Lord, precious to God. You're being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so what, in a sense, the priests were going to, in a sense, foreshadow, all believers have those blessings, and all believers have those privileges. And we should think about that in our priestly service to God, where we offer spiritual sacrifices, whether that's a sacrifice of worship or of good works and good deeds. These are sacrifices that we offer up to God, and that should give us greater appreciation for what we are doing. Because you see how precious that was under the old law, how much more so now under the new, as what it was pointing to is fulfilled. So, all right, in the next section, verses 8 through 20. We see instructions for the contributions for the priests. So we'll all remember now, we'll get to the division of the land in the book of Joshua, but the tribe of Levi, so the priests and the Levites, didn't have a designated tribal area. And consequently, there were going to be means by which they were provided for, and that was going to be through the gifts and the offerings and the tithes of the people. So instructions for how the priests were to be provided for in verses 8 through 10. There were several means. Joel, if you want to jump in on any of this, feel free. But in verses 8 through 10, the food that they were to eat, they were to get a certain portion of the grain offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. And so there'd be a certain portion of that was given to them. If they had family, then that family that was clean, they could share in the wave offering. But this was holy to the Lord, and that's why it said only if your family members are clean. In verse 11, can you share that with them? Oil, wine, and grain was to be shared amongst the priest's family. Verse 14, it says every devoted thing. There could be a couple senses in which something was devoted to God. One, people were able to make free will offerings, and if somebody, out of the desire of their heart to show their love for God, they say, hey, I want to give this piece of land to the Lord, then the priests would be the ones that were given that. And it would be in their possession until the year of Jubilee. And so if someone could devote something to God, a gift to the Lord, they would go to them. Also, the spoils of war that weren't to be destroyed, those were given to the Lord, and that in turn would be taken and given to the priests as well. So any devoted thing, that's a sense in which they were continued to be provided for. The redemption price of a firstborn child would go to the priest. The redemption price for an unclean animal, certain portions of the firstborn that was brought in the redemption sacrifice were given to them as well. And so God is just setting forth the way in which the priests are going to be cared for, because they're going to be laboring on behalf of the people to God. It's fair in the eyes of the Lord for them to be able to enjoy some of the gifts and receive their provision from the gifts that are being brought. Thoughts?
Well, I think it probably in a way that doesn't resonate with us as much, the fact that they gave the 10th of everything. They gave the first of everything. There was a constant reminder, should have been a constant reminder for Israel of the source of those blessings. And that's obviously true for us too. But then he in turn, he didn't need those resources, but he uses those resources to really care for his people, to provide spiritual care for his people. And we talk about that sometimes with the contribution. God doesn't need what we contribute to the church treasury. We need to give that expression of gratitude, that sacrifice, that helps us remember that we're the beneficiaries of way more than anything we could ever think to give.
And it reminds us that God has given to us. And so what we give back to God is really just what he's entrusted to our care. Verse 19 is kind of interesting. You want to talk about the covenant of salt a little bit?
Well, yeah, we're getting all kinds of trouble. I don't know exactly what to say about it, except when you think about salt, what does salt do? Yeah, it's a preservative, it's a purifier, and I thought about that. It references back to Leviticus chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, where it says, "No grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. As for the offering of the firstfruits, you shall offer them to the Lord, but they shall not be burned on the altar for a sweet aroma. And every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt." And then it references it again in 2 Chronicles chapter 13 in relation to David and his throne.
Yeah, I'd say kind of to the point that the salt is a preservative. I think it's kind of connected here. We're talking about this being your perpetual due. It's a covenant of salt forever. And so I think the salt might help symbolize the forever persistent element of this covenant with the Levitical priesthood and the Levitical priests. Something that I learned about salt, maybe I should say I relearned this. I probably picked this up in chemistry. The salt is indestructible in the sense that it doesn't burn. And so there's another forever element of it, I think, symbolized in both its preservative nature, causing things to endure, and its indestructibility in the fire.
Well, and you think about salt in terms of the promises and the blessings and the cursings at the end of Leviticus. It was a reminder to be faithful, and if they were faithful, they would be preserved. But if they were unfaithful in their sacrifices and their duty to the Lord in obeying the commandments, they would receive the curses from the law. Philip?
I think you kind of hit it right there at the last thing you said.
Oh, wow.
We heard a sermon last Sunday, and one of the points made in there was a quote by somebody who wrote. He was talking about the curtains in the temple, the tabernacle being, should have the color blue and gold. And it was not that God likes the color blue. It's that he is commanding it, and he expects you to follow the commandments. And he's given a command here to offer the grain offerings with salt. And it's not because he likes the taste of salt in that sacrifice, the smell of salt, but, it's a command. And they have to do it as God said, and that's the way we should be worshiping today, is by how God has commanded in no other way.
There may be more to it than that, but it's speculation. What it comes down to ultimately is not our understanding, but the fact that God said, this is how you're to do it, so this is why you do it this way. Yeah, good point. Lance?
It does say there's salt in the covenant, that tells you what it's for. If someone is not part of God's covenant, the old covenant, for example, and they bring the offering, it is only projected an abomination to God. If someone takes an offering and gives it to God, and they're not living in accordance with the covenant, it is an abomination before God, if you grab the word and shut, then that continues against their claim. So we know what the salt and covenant is for. It's every offering you give, you're supposed to be reminded that this is meaningless unless you're already part of my covenant, already living the way I've told you to. Then these offerings have value. But it's not the offering itself, it's the heart following God. And that's every sacrifice is supposed to have that reminder.
Yeah, in Proverbs, I think, or Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, Solomon says the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. And that's because they're living outside of the expectations of the covenant, right? And so, you know, to your point, the covenant was the reminder of their relationship with the Lord. And so that was something that was to be kept in view in giving these sacrifices and making these offerings. All right. In verses 21 through 24, so the priests are cared for through some of the various offerings, the various sacrifices, the redemption prices, the spoils of war, the dedications and things of that nature. The Levites received their provision through the tithes. And in verses 25 through 32, they're told, now the priests didn't have to do this, but the Levites did. The tithes, or the 10% that the people would bring and give to the Lord, that would go to the Levites. The Levites were then to take 10% of the tithe that they received, and we were trying to talk to the kids fractionally with supper as we're talking about this. So they would give 1% total of what was brought and given to the Lord, but of the tithe that they received, they would give a tenth. The Levites would give a tenth in turn to the priest. And in verse 29, what portion of the tithe was given? So the people brought the best. What the Levites give of their tithe was the best. So God gets the best of the best, and that's how it always is in our service to the Lord. So there is actually an instance where, you know, you wonder maybe what's the relevance of this? Can you think of an instance in Scripture where we see this instruction coming to bear, or maybe the disobedience to this instruction coming to bear? Kind of an obscure instance. The very end of Nehemiah, which is really at the close of the Old Testament. Nehemiah, after having straightened out most of the problems with the people of Judah, he goes back to serve the king, and he comes back again. And he says that the Levites had left their post where they're supposed to be laboring in the temple. They've left their post because the people had quit bringing the tithe. And so, because the people hadn't brought the tithe to provide for the Levites are having to go and work for their own food to provide for their families. And he has to straighten them out and kind of set some things in place so that the tithe would be restored. Then in turn, the people the Levites could enter into service to the Lord again. Okay, and so this is kind of just a place where this particular instruction would tie in. So Levites receive their provision from the tithe, priests from sacrifices and gifts and things of that nature. Comments, questions, thoughts?
It's also Malachi chapter 3, where it talks about the man who robbed God,
Mhm.
and you were robbing me, but you say, how I robbed you in tithes,
Yep.
contributions.
Yep. Yep, and what they were bringing, what quality was it?
Lame.
Yeah, lame, blind, sick. So, again, God specifies what's to be offered and brought to him. All right, chapter 19 is, this really kind of kicks off a pretty weird chapter, but I think one that's got some value for us here. He starts off speaking about a kind of a strange, I don't know that you'd call it a sacrifice because it was taken outside of the tabernacle area, outside of the encampment of Israel. So it's called the red heifer. And to Philip's point, Annabelle said tonight when we were talking about this, why the heifer had to be red? And what she was asking for, what's the significance of it being red? And I said, because God said it was to be red. You know, we don't know. Maybe there was some symbolic connection that God had made or that he communicated to them that we don't have recorded. We don't know. God said red, so they're to take the red heifer. And she was slaughtered outside the camp. Blood was sprinkled toward the tent of meeting. The heifer itself was burned with fire, and cedar, hyssop, and scarlet yarn were burned with it. And you go back to Leviticus 14. These are objects that are relating to having cleansing properties. So the priest and the man who burned the heifer, they would be unclean. Then someone was to go and was to gather the ashes from the heifer after it burned up and to put them outside the camp in a clean place, and that person was unclean. And the purpose of this was those ashes were going to be used for a special kind of ceremonial cleansing. What cleansing was it going to, the ashes of the red heifer going to accomplish? What would that purify the people from?
Those who touch dead
Okay.
bodies are raised.
Right. So contact from coming into contact with the dead body. And you think about where we are in Israel's history. So they're preparing to wander for 38 years, 40 years, and over 600,000 of them are going to die. So there's going to, because God is a holy God, the people must maintain their ceremonial purity. Those who aren't have to be outside of the camp until they're able to be cleansed because of the holiness of the Lord. And it's the ashes from this red heifer that are mixed with water and then sprinkled on the person who's come into contact with a dead body, whether in the field or in the tent, however that happens. Some specifics are given in that regard. Thus, they could be cleansed from just responsibilities that they were going to have as life progressed. And so you think of someone who's got to deal with that and see to maybe the burial of a parent or a grandparent or whatever the case may be. And yes, they're going to be unclean, but God provides this as a means for them to be cleansed from coming into contact with death. Joel, you have any thoughts on that you want to?
Well, yeah, you just think about the
Sure.
nature of a heifer is that it had never been pregnant, so it had never been it was pure in that sense. It had never been yoked, so it had never been tasked with being worked in the field. Like all the other sacrifices, it had to be without blemish. But then, unlike the other sacrifice, it's cast out, it's set aside, and I think probably for all of us that echoes forward to Jesus being crucified outside the camp. You're right; it doesn't say. I assume the red should, at least in my mind, I immediately when I hear red, I think about blood.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably intentional. One of the things that I think is really interesting about that is, can you imagine the things they must have wondered about why to do this? Like, we don't have any indication that God said, hey, this is a symbol pointing forward to my son coming. But it goes back to what Philip mentioned and you mentioned. God says this is what you have to do if you want to be in a fellowship with me once you come into contact with death. And man, the echoes there should just ripple forward.
Well, and yeah, I was going to talk about that a little bit. Just and wondering this because you're probably thinking it as well. What's the big deal about ceremonial purity? And we did make that distinction, I think, in one of the classes that Luke and Lauren taught in regard to moral impurity, which is a violation of God's law that involves sin, and ceremonial impurity, which is not sinful, but it is a state in which a person must be removed from the presence of God. And so that occurred in just living life, from coming in contact with that which was unclean, or from various other activities that just were part of living life. But this ceremonial purity was something that was significant, particularly in this instance as it relates to death. And that's what the red heifer was for the purification of those who had contacted a dead body. And in this regard, particularly, you think about why this particular cleansing is mentioned. And so the coming into contact with death, it represents the presence of death in a holy, amongst God's holy people. Death symbolizes the ultimate consequence of sin. You think about Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, the wages of sin are death. And then Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And so death symbolizes sin's ultimate result. And one writer I came across put it this way. He said, death is something like sin made visible. And so there's got to be this special purification, especially in regard to those who come in contact with death. And so Israel being a camp of life and holiness with God dwelling among his people, to bring death into the camp was something that had to be dealt with and cleansed. It was a reminder of how the people were to be distinct from the nations. If Israel ignored this impurity, then they would no longer be holy to the Lord. And that's what this, among many other commandments or strange commandments, are given, because they were being set apart to be unlike all of the nation. And then, as has been mentioned, it pointed them to, and they wouldn't have understood this at the time, but God's going to bring this full circle. And it pointed to a better cleansing that was going to come. In fact, Hebrews chapter 9, verses 13 and 14 make a specific reference to this sacrifice of the red heifer, where it says, speaking and then pointing to Jesus, for if the blood of bulls, goats and bulls, and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, so that's the sacrifice being referenced here, sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So while the ashes of the heifer could bring about a bodily cleansing, it would take something much more to address the cleansing of sin upon our soul. And it's the blood of Jesus that was required, the only sacrifice great enough to provide cleansing at a depth of that level. So kind of just a pointing forward to physical cleansing, but Christ provides us better sacrifice that cleanses more deeply than the animals would. Yes, sir.
Sometimes it's very wise way to get dead bodies. If the medical community had safety knows, hospitals from basically 1400 until 1850 would not have the highest mortality rate for women giving birth. Because they would touch a dead body, and go and help hold the baby after the woman's giving birth, help sew her up, make sure she's fine, and so she'd get sick and die, and so women were afraid to go to the hospital to give birth because the doctor would get sick and they'd die. They know these lines are not microscopic period, but this is teaching you that when you touch something unclean, there's a period in which you yourself are unclean, and you need to take the time to make sure you're good before you go on and do something else. That's an important concept spiritually, but also physically too. Very wise.
Yeah, and you just have to appreciate it. We know that that wasn't God's primary purpose, but that and many other laws, they were given for the benefit of God's people. We didn't look at the passages, but if somebody, say, died inside of a tent, then that tent had to be ceremonially purified. And to Lance's point, some of the washings that would have taken place would have at least done a better job anyway if you're just doing nothing at all of cleaning up the area post-mortem of the person who died. So.
But at that point, I assume that the salt of the covenant that would go with the grain offerings would also serve a functional purpose of making it last longer.
And here's one more spiritual principle we can pick up from verse 20. If the man who is unclean does not cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, since he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, because the water for impurity has not been thrown on him. He is unclean. And so that's talking about those who were ceremonially unclean, remaining and not being purified, then they had to be cut off. And the principle being, sin that's not dealt with contaminates others. Okay, and so it's sin comes into your life, there has to be cleansing that takes place, and if it doesn't, the contamination of sin will spread. Okay, so that has to be dealt with. That's a spiritual principle we can derive from that. Any comments from chapters 19? All right, getting back to the good stuff, I say the good stuff, the death of Miriam pops up, that's not what I mean. The good stuff is the narrative, not the strange laws and sacrifices that sometimes are hard. I hope we were able to kind of connect some of the things that were there. Some of those details separated or reading them independently, you may not appreciate. I hope we were able to give a little appreciation for some of the more challenging texts, or the more, what we might call the less interesting texts. But anyway, moving on with the narrative. Joel, you want to carry us into chapter 20 with some wisdom?
Well, yeah, I mean, so they're journeying along, and Miriam passes away, and they bury her in Kadesh. I read a couple different things that maybe it's the same Kadesh they've been at previously. There was a distinction that this one references it's part of the wilderness of Zin, and previous references to Kadesh have talked about it being in the wilderness of Paran. Those two areas kind of overlap, so maybe it's the same place. But it did cross my mind that as they're wandering around now for about 38 years, right? They're getting here sooner rather than later. They're going to start making their way toward the promised land. But members of that generation have been dying off. How many times must have they passed by the same places? And how many times, if this is the same Kadesh, in those 40 years, must they have had reminders of their rebellion and their disobedience and their lack of trust in God, and how hard that must have been? And then to watch as one member of the generation after another passes away in the wilderness, and what God said is exactly true. And then Miriam obviously is one of the key players in there. And so she passes away, and then you have this scene where Moses and Aaron I mean, same song, different verse, right? They find themselves out in the wilderness, and the people complain. Verses 4 and 5 says, "Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." So maybe of all the things that they could complain about while ignoring that it's their fault, why is this the constant complaint that Israel has again and again, you think? Okay, yeah, it's a necessity. They have to have it. But don't you think at this point they should have learned that God's going to provide for them, right? They've yet to not have water to drink or food to eat. It might not be the food they wanted, but they've always had their needs met. So why is it, and then is there a parallel for us?
We make that needs being met is not the same as abundance. And so they may have been living in shoestring budget. And so they may have been constantly conscientious of how they're using it, knowing God will provide. We're not sure when. So there may be an element of they aren't satisfied with what God is giving them, even though it is an adequate amount. And I think there's obviously less than that.
Kind of like a kid that asks for a specific Christmas present, then Christmas comes, they open it up, it's not what they want, and they fuss about it, you know? But they want the niceties that were mentioned there. That's the very things they asked for. You know, the land that you brought us to, it's not a place of grain and figs or vines or pomegranates. So there's like this expectation that they have. Their needs were being met, but not their wants, and so they're complaining about it. And I think that's, you know, a significant lesson.
Well, one of the things I jotted down is that our bellies are really powerful tools, right? I don't know about you, but I'm good for about 3 hours, and then I want something to eat or I want something to drink. And I'm good for 2 or 3 hours, but if I go 6 hours and I haven't had anything to eat, it becomes a bigger issue in my mind. And if I go much longer than that, before long, the only thing I'm thinking about is when I'm going to get something to eat or when I'm going to get something to drink. And I think you see that, the carnal nature in them, but I think you see that in us, whether it's not being satisfied with what God chooses to give us, whether it's my focus being there rather on more important things. But I think for all of us, our bellies, and by that I mean all of our appetites, can be consuming and can cause us to fall away in a pretty big hurry.
I think I'm hearing you say that they complained because they were hungry.
They were hungry. They needed a Snickers.
So yeah, Philippians chapter 3, Paul talks about these people whose God is their belly. I mean, and the belly in a sense is just representative of our appetites, our fleshly appetites, and that may relate to food or may relate to sex or anything that a person can experience in the body. You know, is kind of an appetite that we may have, and so.
And then obviously verse 10, you know,
Verse 8 talks about the command to, you know, he tells them how to get the water.
Right.
Where it says, speak to the rock and it'll yield its water. And then you got verse 10.
right. And so he's told to speak to the rock. Verse 10, you know, when I was a kid in classes, what I remember learning was that it was because he struck the rock, which it was, right? But I don't remember as a young person having the emphasis on what he says. And what he says is at least as bad as what he did, right? Because when he says, shall we bring forth water from you from this rock, what's he done? He's elevated himself to at least a co-equal with God, right?
I've got an interesting thought on it. I'd be interested in hearing your thought and others. I've always thought that as well. So the statement he makes in verse 10, he says, shall we bring water to you out of this rock? And I was going to ask, who is the we? And I think most of us say the we is me and God, right?
I don't think so.
I
I
think
used to think so, but I don't think so.
is that where you were going?
Yes, it was.
Go.
Well, that was the other part was,
Joel and I have studied independently, but it sounds like we both came to a similar conclusion on this matter.
well, so again, another one of those things, Moses was denied going into the land, but Moses wasn't the only one denied going in the land. And in fact,
For this event
for
here.
this particular thing, because he says, shall we, but then in verse 12, when God calls him to task, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. And whether Aaron was explicitly, I mean, they were both frustrated, which is interesting. All the other times they intercede for the people, but for whatever reason, this one got the better of them. Maybe they were grieving over their sister. But whether explicitly or just passively, Aaron seems to be called to answer for this as well.
Yeah, you get to verse 24. Let Aaron be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land that I have given to the people of Israel, because you rebelled against my commandment at the waters of Meribah. And so I think he was in on that. And we kind of mentioned that Aaron seems to be kind of the go-along guy, doesn't he? I mean, he did that with Exodus chapter 32. You know, make us a sacrifice. Okay, bring me your stuff. Aaron's the go-along guy. He goes along with Miriam to confront Moses, and now he seems to have gone along with Moses
Golden calf.
to strike the rock. And so he kind of just gets caught up in the shenanigans of everybody else. He doesn't really seem to be the ringleader of them, but he's a participant. And that says something about just being involved. If you may not be the ringleader in a particular event, but if you're in association, you know, there's guilt to be found there.
Psalm 106 gives us a little bit of commentary on it, where it says, they also provoked him to wrath at the waters of Meribah, so that it went badly with Moses on their account, because they were rebellious against his spirit. He spoke rashly with his lips. We can see, I think with the they, it was both of them being rebellious.
Yeah.
But they were provoked.
No excuse.
Yeah, gotta keep it in check.
Yeah.
Well, again, and you think, I mean, we talked about the people and their failings again and again, but again, in verse 12, he explicitly says, because you did not believe me. Moses and Aaron failed to trust God, that he would do what he said he did. And you did not hallow me. The governmental leader and the spiritual leaders of the nation failed to honor God, and look at the impact. Ben?
God's indictment against Moses and Aaron reminds me of oftentimes when we have to say, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. Before all the people, I will be honored. They didn't do what God had told them to do.
And that's an interesting connection between, because so many in the religious world struggle to connect faith and obedience together. Yes, it was the striking of the rock when God commanded speaking to the rock, but whenever he gets down to the root of Moses' disobedience, it's because you didn't believe me. Okay. And so so he connects there his lack of belief with his disobedience. And you know, we if you can see it, you can see it, but so many in the religious world seem to struggle to see it. But it's just a reminder that where disobedience flows from is unbelief. But you can't say I believe if there's no obedience connected to that. So that connection I see being made here when the Lord rebukes him for what he's done. All right, so they're told that Moses and Aaron are going to be, and I've always thought that was a harsh punishment, but as has been mentioned, these were the two most influential individuals amongst the people of Israel, and with that responsibility of leadership falls a greater burden, I think, and I think that's part of why they're kept out of the land. It was not a harsh punishment; it was a just punishment because of who they were and the responsibility that they bore before the people, and their transgression was no minor infraction. They didn't hallow God before the people, and there were consequences that went along with that.
Zach, before you jump to that
Yeah.
to the next section, and I thought about this too. You think about the Exodus, that period was 50 chapters. Was it 50 chapters or 50 some odd chapters? It was a bunch of chapters, right? I mean, a lot of pages of the Bible in a relatively short span of time. Well, here in the course of 4 chapters, we've covered 40 years, or almost covered 40 years.
Yeah, I think the end of 19 and the beginning of 20. I think that's where most of the time takes place, as I understand the chronology.
So spiritually speaking, in terms of God's plan to bring people to Canaan, what happened during these 4 or 5 chapters? Nothing, right? It was a waste of time, except for God's consequence, God's punishment of purifying the nation from that generation that chose to not trust him and refused to go into the land. And that's really interesting. There was so much in a section of it, and here you've got 4 decades that just get passed by with minimal detail because it wasn't accomplished in God's
Nothing of any
will.
significance.
Yeah.
Really helps us to see, for those people, it was an absolute detriment, cost them their life. God is not bound by time the way
He could wait them out.
he waited them out. Blink in a chapter or two, and you're done.
So the next major event is they're trying to pass through Edom to get to where they're going, and they request permission from the Edomites. And so you remember they're brothers with Israel. They come from Esau, and king doesn't let them pass through. So we'll talk a little bit more about this next week or upcoming Sunday, next Bible class, where we kind of see the path that they take. And I'm not terribly big on maps, but they weren't able to just, they could have, you look at where they're at in Kadesh right there, they might have otherwise, because they're gonna end up on the plains of Moab right over here across from Jericho, and they might have taken that way, but rather than being allowed to cut through the Edomites territory, they're forbidden from doing that, and so they have to pass through kind of the roundabout way, and we're gonna see that causes some consternation amongst the people, and carrying a set of consequences all its own, into having to take the long way around. So they're tired of the desert, and they're not going to deal real fondly with that rejection. And then finally, the chapter concludes with the death of Aaron. In verse 24, the Lord says, "Let Aaron be gathered to his people." And this is because he was complicit in the disobedience that took place at Meribah with the striking of the rock. And very publicly, Aaron is divested of his authority. Had a little mention of this last week. So before all the people, it seems like he is disrobed as the high priest, and his son is appointed to serve as high priest in his place. And I just want to share this quote in closing. You think about Aaron, and Aaron had a lot of flaws, but he was God's chosen high priest, and I appreciated the sentiment of this statement. Aaron, though he dies for his transgression, is not put to death as a malefactor by a plague or fire from heaven, but he dies with ease and in honor. He's not cut off from his people, as the expression usually is concerning those that die by the hand of divine justice, but he is gathered to his people as one that died in the arms of divine grace. And so I just, for a man who was as flawed as he was, and we're probably overemphasizing that he's proportionate to the good that he did as the priest of God, but to see the way that the Lord dealt with him as his life came to a close, and then very publicly setting up his successor. So Hebrews will talk a lot about the passing of the priesthood from father to son, and the enduring priesthood of Jesus. But that's how chapter 20 concludes. Aaron's life concludes, and so there's really just one man left, and won't get to his passing for quite a while. But I think the author wants us to see the closing of this one generation and the beginning of the new. So, thank you for your participation and your thoughts and comments tonight.